Welcome to Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM. I'm Jamie Eisenberg. That's Heath Cummings. And Heath, fantasy managers are starting to freak out because we got one practice report in already, and it's not good from Indianapolis. Jonathan Taylor is not at practice dealing with that ankle sprain. Oh, my God, sound the panic alarm. We got a lot to talk to today, a lot to cover. Hopefully, our buddy Robert Term is going to join us for our running back roundtable, but we're going to do our start, bench, cut segment that we always do that everybody loves. We're going to answer your questions. Send this to them on Twitter, X, using the hashtag AskFFT, and we're going to help you set those lineups for week number 5. Remember, there are 4 teams on a bye in week 5, so a lot of lineup decisions you probably have to make, and a lot of probably questionable situations dealing with some injuries and maybe even a trade that could happen with Davante Adams. Let's start with Jonathan Taylor. Heath, so missed practice on Wednesday, not a huge surprise, dealing with what's reported as a mild high ankle sprain. Say that 10 times fast. But he got hurt in the week 4 win against Pittsburgh, and now we're waiting to see if he's going to be able to play in the week 5 game against Jacksonville, which is an unbelievable matchup. Jaguars number 2 in most fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. So how are you approaching Jonathan Taylor, Trey Sermon, this Colts backfield in this dream scenario against Jacksonville?
Well, the first thing is if Trey Sermon's on the waiver wire, you need to go acquire him, especially if you have Jonathan Taylor. We didn't really expect Taylor to practice on Wednesday, so I'm not going to try to overreact to that at this point. But I do think it just makes that addition of Sermon that much more important. And like you said, it's a fantastic matchup. While Sermon hasn't been particularly effective as a rusher so far this season, he wouldn't rank as high as you see. We all have apparently kiss of death for Jonathan Taylor. We all have him ranked as a top 10 running back. I think you'd view Sermon somewhere closer to 15 to 20 range, but still someone that would be pretty close to a must-start option. And, may have some staying power. It may be a mild high ankle sprain, but we've seen high ankle sprains both keep running backs out for multiple weeks and be recurring issues. So this is a little bit concerning.
And there's an example of it for the Colts and how they handled this with Josh Downs, who had a high ankle sprain in training camp, and we didn't see him play in week 1 or week 2, working into the rotation slowly in week 3, and now back to himself week 4. But it was a 5-6 week injury based on how long he was out. So hopefully it's not the same thing for Jonathan Taylor. Just something to keep an eye on here. And again, you'll see where Trey Sermon ranks if we get to the end of the week and Taylor not playing against Jacksonville. Don't forget about Tyler Goodson in some deeper leagues. He's also going to get some work probably in tandem with Trey Sermon, which could make it a messy backfield. But we're going to be, I think, in the camp of Trey Sermon being at least a flex, maybe a number 2 running back based on the matchup against Jacksonville. All right, so we got the story that's circulating around the NFL. Davante Adams has requested a trade, and we're getting reports from ESPN that the 2 teams he would like to be traded to, no surprise, the Jets to be reunited with Aaron Rodgers, or the Saints to be reunited with Derek Carr. Remember, he went to the Raiders specifically to play with Derek Carr, who was his quarterback in college at Fresno State. So, Heath, let's just talk about the potential landing spots for Adams, throwing in the Jets, throwing in the Saints. But where do you think is the best spot for him to maximize his fantasy value? Because at 31 years old, he's off to a slow start, got this hamstring injury, which may or may not actually be an injury. He could just be sitting out, or the Raiders holding him out because they don't want to get hurt to hurt his trade value. But he is on the injury report. So where's the best place that will maximize Davante Adams as a fantasy asset?
So, yeah, I had 3 suggestions, and the first one was the Kansas City Chiefs. Obviously, they just lost Rashee Rice. They've already lost Marquise Brown. And what I was thinking of is here, what is going to help Adams' fantasy value, and also what is going to not destroy someone else's fantasy value. And there's really, I don't think, anybody's value to destroy in Kansas City. I've heard a lot of people say there's no way the Raiders would trade him within the division. Maybe that's true, but the state of the Raiders organization, they should just get as much draft capital as they can so they can hopefully acquire a franchise quarterback at some point in the future. Then they can worry about who's competitive and who's not. My option number 2, another team in the AFC, would be the Buffalo Bills. Khalil Shakir has been a pleasant surprise early on. Keon Coleman, there's still some hope for, but man, if you get Josh Allen, a true number 1 wide receiver, and get Davante Adams with a truly elite quarterback once again, it could be fantastic. And then I've got the Jets on there at number 3. I think Adams probably goes right back to being Aaron Rodgers' favorite target if he's on the Jets. The only problem with that landing spot, and the reason why it's not my number 1 choice, is I think it completely destroys Garrett Wilson.
Oh, 100%. I mean, Wilson's been bad so far this season based on expectations, and now you bring in somebody who could be the alpha there, clearly based on Adams' relationship and history and performance, but certainly his history with Aaron Rodgers. That would be disastrous for Garrett Wilson. I love the Buffalo call. The Buffalo call to me makes the most sense, just because I don't think that the Chiefs and Raiders will be able to come to some sort of agreement, unless, of course, the Chiefs just over overpay for Adams, which I don't know if they're going to do that, with the hope that maybe, Marquise Brown does make a recovery, or we're still holding out hope that Rashee Rice can still at some point play this season. But if he does stay in the conference, Buffalo to me is the most likely choice. I could also see Pittsburgh, because we know they're in the market for Brandon Ayuk, and that would be a situation where, yes, it would hurt George Pickens clearly, but also still allow him to be the 1A or at least a strong number 2. But clearly they would be making this type of move because they would want to throw the ball a little bit more. And I could also see maybe a situation like Washington, where Dane Daniels, has Terry McLaurin, but really nothing else behind him. And you're looking at it now. The type of move I think that it makes sense is where you have one of these like reclamation type quarterbacks, but I don't think Tampa Bay, for example, is going to make a move toward Davante Adams. I don't think Seattle. I don't think Minnesota, for example, the teams that have these quarterbacks that are playing well on these cheap deals. But a team that is on a quarterback with a rookie deal that has a chance right now to compete, and I think Washington's certainly in that category. Jaden Daniels getting Davante Adams would be tremendous for both those guys. But I could also see the same situation playing itself out where maybe they send either Shaheed or Olave, most likely I would guess Shaheed, back to Las Vegas, and then you allow, still Olave to be productive with Derek Carr. Again, it would be similar to Garrett Wilson. It would crush his upside, but I think he could still be productive in that situation. But this is going to be a story that we're monitoring. At this point, if you're a Davante Adams fantasy manager, Heath, what are you doing? Are you trying to sell? Are you trying to buy if you don't have him? Just in terms of his fantasy value, like where do you sort of stand with him now moving forward with this level of uncertainty?
Well, I didn't really want to draft him in the first 3 rounds of fantasy drafts coming into the year. And now that we've got the hamstring injury, we think it's a hamstring injury, I'm probably going to be more skeptical than the market. If I have Davante Adams, I'm probably hoping that I can sell to someone else. Hey, Davante Adams is about ready to get a quarterback upgrade. You should pay for him. He's going to be a top 12 wide receiver again. If I can't get top 12, top 15 wide receiver value, and I don't think that's unrealistic. He was being drafted that high by a lot of people before the season. If I can't get that, then I'm probably holding.
And then we get the Raiders situation, because if he's going to leave Las Vegas and probably not going to play anytime soon, because again, I don't think they want to risk him getting hurt. What does this mean? Forget about the quarterbacks, because nobody's relying on them. But for Brock Bowers, for Jacoby Myers, for Trey Tucker now, who's had 2 productive fantasy outings in the last 2 weeks, even for the running backs there, who do you look at? Who benefits? Who loses? Is there a winner in all of this from Las Vegas perspective?
I think Brock Bowers just remains a top 5 tight end. Not sure anything changes there. The big winner's going to be Jacoby Myers after this week. You think of Jacoby Myers as this slot wide receiver, only played 22% of his snaps in the slot last week. He's going to be the outside number 1 wide receiver, and they're facing the Broncos this week and Pat Surtain. So you don't want to use Jacoby Myers this week. But if you're telling me the rest of the season he gets to be the number 1 wide receiver in this Raiders offense, we saw how Gardner Minshew targeted Michael Pittman last year. I would expect 8 to 10 targets per game for Jacoby Myers, which will make him a borderline number 2 wide receiver. And yes, you should add Trey Tucker.
Yep, just to see what happens. Again, even if it's a tough matchup this week against the Broncos, and they're both probably going to struggle. It's not just Surtain shutting down the number 1. The number 2 hasn't exactly been very good against Denver secondary so far this season, but they should be roster across the board because the upside could be there for them based on volume, based on opportunity. And even if they make the switch to Aiden O'Connell, Myers' only touchdown this season did come from O'Connell when he replaced Gardner Minshew 2 weeks ago. So just something to keep in mind. It's not necessarily just Minshew helping these guys. O'Connell could do the same thing as well. Let's go to the Dolphins right now, because this is a team that has a lot of fantasy managers freaking out, and they made the decision already to start Tyler Huntley for week 5 against the Patriots. We saw how that looked in week 4 against the Titans. It was bad. And so you're looking at the 2 receivers and the running back here in Tyreek Hill, Jaylen Waddle, and Devon Achane. Are they still must-start fantasy options taking on a Patriots defense that's been very up and down through the first 4 weeks of the season?
I'm still going to view Achane as pretty much a must-start running back. I think he's still just barely inside of my top 12. The rushing efficiency has been bad, and I think the target share won't be as good with Huntley as it would be with a Skylar Thompson, but he's still a guy that I'm starting at running back, still has the ability, like Tyreek Hill, to go make your day in one play. It's just getting harder and harder to believe that Tyreek Hill still has the ability to do that, and so I would probably try to stay away from Tyreek Hill.
So is he outside of your top 24? You're not ranking him as a number 2 receiver this week?
I think he's like 21 or 22. I'm just hoping that I have 2 wide receivers that I can start over him. I think we have 129 receiving yards combined in 2 games for Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle. It's just a terrible, terrible situation. And really, I think a lot of people looking at this, if you have a good record, as maybe I should go buy low on these guys because it sounds like Tua's coming back week 8. Well, that would be fantastic. But their end of the season schedule, once again, absolutely awful, just like it was last year, including 2 cold weather games in the last 5 weeks of the fantasy season. I'm not sure I do want to buy low.
I totally agree that end of season production could be awful, but if you're getting them very cheap, why would you not take the chance? Because you still know what they're capable of, and you know they're going to be motivated if they're trying to make a playoff push if Tua comes back and they're not completely out of it. It's just very frustrating that to get the Titans and the Patriots in back-to-back weeks, you would think this offense would be ready to explode, but clearly the quarterback situation holding them back. I'm concerned about Achane as well. I just think what we saw last week was a little tough because the Titans' run defense is fantastic. This week's run defense not as hard to overcome. And with 4 teams on a bye, it's very difficult to sit someone with Achane's potential. Just keep an eye on Raheem Mostert if he does return, because then that makes things even more challenging for Achane's ceiling to be there. But like you said, 1 play for him, 1 play for Tyreek, hopefully 1 play for Jaylen Waddle if you're still forced to start him. But it's just been totally awful with the quarterback situation in Miami now without Tua Tagovailoa, as Heath said, until at least week 8. All right, we got a game on Thursday night. It's a division rival in the NFC South, the Falcons and the Bucs, in what is looking like a very entertaining matchup here. You know, you got 2 teams that sort of mirror each other, quarterback questions, wide receiver questions, certainly running back questions now, which I don't think a lot of people thought would happen. But let's start with the situation there. Let's talk about the quarterbacks here. So you got Baker Mayfield coming off another strong game, over 30 fantasy points. You got Kirk Cousins coming off a disappointing game here. I think it's probably easy at this point to say we're starting Baker and sitting Kirk Cousins, but do you have any faith in Cousins taking on this Bucs secondary, which could be down Antoine Winfield once again?
Yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic about Kirk Cousins, but more as a QB2 than a QB1. I think he's QB 15 or 16 with 4 teams on a bye. I guess maybe that's not too optimistic, but I don't think the Tampa Bay defense is going to be that big of a problem for him. I do think he's going to have to throw a lot, but then they'll be playing from behind due to what Baker Mayfield's been doing in this passing game. So I think Cousins is a good QB2. Mayfield doesn't necessarily have a great matchup, but he's the number 1 quarterback in fantasy. You're not going to sit that guy. Top 6 quarterback for me this week.
Averaged 21 fantasy points per game in the 2 meetings with Atlanta last season, 1 18-point game, 1 24-point game. So you kind of see the floor and the ceiling, at least based on how this Falcons defense should operate. Let's talk about the Bucs passing game, though, because the receiving core here has been, you know, I think in a lot of people's minds, somewhat polarizing. Drake London off to a slow start. He's been very good the last 3 weeks. Darnell Mooney was good 2 weeks ago for the week 2 and week 3 game. Disappointed last week. And Kyle Pitts has just been a disappearing act. Did score a touchdown in week 1, but we know the last 3 weeks have been miserable. And last week, 3 targets, no catches. Raheem Morris saying stats are for nerds. He doesn't care about what Kyle Pitts is doing. So do you have any more faith? I know you're a little bit, hesitant on where you rank Drake London. Do you have more faith in him now? Where are you at with Darnell Mooney? Where are you at with Kyle Pitts?
Yeah, I would like to not start Kyle Pitts. He's not inside of my top 12 tight ends, and that's saying something because the position is terrible. I would start Tucker Kraft over him if I could go find him on the waiver wire. I think, like, I understand you guys got him ranked top 12. There aren't 12 good top tight ends, so it's not hard to make that argument that maybe he just catches 1 pass for a touchdown. That would be fantastic. With London, I still view him mostly as a number 2 wide receiver. This week we've got a lot of injuries. We've got 4 teams on a bye, so he's pretty close to wide receiver 12 for me. I just wish that Drake London could make some big plays. I'm not saying it's all his fault, but the lack of yak, the lack of downfield plays, he's really reliant on having a lot of catches. Right now, wide receiver 30 per game through 4 weeks. A lot of that's because of the bad week 1. But we're going to need to see another good game from here for him to be a must-start wide receiver. And then Darnell Mooney, kind of that boom-bust number 3 wide receiver. The Tampa Bay defense has not given up a lot of big plays this year. So that might be difficult for Mooney, but I still like that 20% target share and the ability to go score from just about anywhere on the field.
Real quick, Heath, do you have any concern about Bijan Robinson? Because last week was troubling. Tyler Algier outperforming him. Are we out on Bijan right now?
My only concern with Bijan Robinson is how is that hamstring? If he's 100%, he's 100% in my lineup.
Yeah, I think everybody's starting to see I'm the low guy on him at 14, but it's a little troubling. It's a shoulder injury that was coming into week 4. It's a hamstring injury going into week 5, and it's Vita Vea on the other side, so it's not going to be easy for him to run the ball against this Bucs defense, but hopefully he's making some plays in the passing game. All right, you have questions. We have answers. Let's get to them now. We're going to answer a bunch of your questions throughout the show, and then we're going to close the show with a bunch of your questions as well as part of our mailbag. So let's see the question here about Geno versus Baker. So relevant to this game, Geno Smith taking on the Giants, Baker Mayfield Thursday night against the Falcons. 12 teams with 4 points for passing touchdowns. Heath, who do you like better?
I like both these guys. They're both top 12 quarterbacks for me this week, but I'm not going away from Baker Mayfield. He is, like I said, a top 6 quarterback. I'm starting Baker.
I would start Baker as well, but I agree. Both guys top 12 for this week. Geno coming off an amazing game. Surprisingly enough, though, does not have multiple passing touchdowns in any game so far this season. Hopefully he gets that against the Giants. All right, we're going to take a break right now. We come back, we're going to take a look at the roster trends, the moves you made on Tuesday night, the most added, the most dropped, the most traded. That's next here on FFT. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM. I'm Jamie, that's Heath. We're taking a look at the roster trends of the moves that you made on Tuesday night, the most added, the most dropped, the most traded. Remember, a lot of leagues run waivers on Wednesday, so this could help you for those waiver wire moves you have to make. Remember, 4 teams on a bye, so it could be very tricky lineups this week, Heath. So let's take a look at the players that were added the most on Tuesday night for CBSSports.com. No surprise when you see Dontavian Wicks and Tucker Kraft. The Packers very popular right now. We know the DSTs are always going to be on this list. We're not going to really spend too much time on them. You got the running backs there next to Trey Sermon and Kareem Hunt, Jerry McNichols, which is interesting. We don't know an update yet on Austin Eckler, who was in the concussion protocol from last week, did not play in the Commanders game in Week 6 against the Cardinals. Justice Hill, Josh Downs, Wan'Dale Robinson, Trey Tucker. Let's talk about the Packers, though, Heath, because we know Christian Watson not expected to be out long-term with that ankle sprain, but we know his track record as well. He tends to miss time, as we saw the last couple of seasons with hamstring injuries. So when you look at Dontavian Wicks, you look at Tucker Kraft, are you looking at them more as one-week replacements, or are you looking at them as long-term options, knowing that Watson can maybe be out a week or two?
You know, I'm thinking probably more long-term for Tucker Kraft just because of how desperate we are at that position. How even in week 1, it kind of looked like he was the clear tight end 1 ahead of Luke Musgrave. And then in week 2, you got to be really careful, or week 4, week 2 of Jordan Love. You got to be really careful with the total number of targets in that Packers offense, because Jordan Love threw more than 50 passes in that game. So I wouldn't expect 9 targets for Tucker Kraft, but I do think he has a chance to be in that 5 to 6 target range on a weekly basis. It's a high-scoring offense. Matt LaFleur's offenses have always had a lot more passing touchdowns than rushing touchdowns, so good touchdown chances on a weekly basis. That makes Kraft a pretty easy top 12 tight end, and hopefully he just stays there. Wicks with the 13 targets, again, kind of same caveat as we had about Kraft's target total. Didn't love the fact that he only caught 5 of them, but if you look at what he did last year, 10 yards per target, whenever he got a chance, he was very productive. I'm viewing him as a boom-bust number 3 wide receiver this week. I was definitely trying to add him, but he wasn't my top wide receiver target.
Who was your top wide receiver target?
It was Wan'Dale Robinson, 27% target share playing alongside Malik Neighbors. This offense, 65% of their passes are going to either Neighbors or Robinson. We've also seen with Brian Dable under controlling things, a higher pass volume than we've ever seen in the Daniel Jones era. He's not taking off and running quite so much, as more and more teams are going to be focusing on trying to find ways to take away Neighbors. I think we're going to see Robinson, at least in full PPR leagues, find himself as a pretty solid wide receiver 3, even when we don't have 4 teams on a bye.
In the 4 games, he has at least 8 targets in 3 of them, at least 6 catches in 3 of them. In the game where he didn't get 6 catches or 8 targets, he scored a touchdown. So he's been very productive for fantasy managers in some way, shape, or form. But as you alluded to, better in PPR than non and half. We know Trey Sermon, why he's on this list. Jonathan Taylor missing practice on Wednesday. As Heath said at the start of the show, we could see Sermon even added in more leagues, because now that we have some more information for those of you running waivers on Wednesday. But Kareem Hunt, the second running back that's on this list, Heath. So how are you approaching the Chiefs backfield, knowing that Clyde Edwards-Helaire can still be activated and they don't have to make that move until tomorrow because they play on Monday?
So I do think that you have to recognize the risk of Clyde Edwards-Helaire coming back and then cutting into Kareem Hunt's workload. But I think that people also need to recognize that if you just watch that Week 4 game and the difference between Kareem Hunt with the ball in his hands and any other running back they had in the roster that game was stark. He looked so much faster than Carson Steele and Samaje Perine. He was making people miss. And this Chiefs offense is desperate for electric playmakers with the loss of Rice, with the loss of Brown, with the lack of options in the receiving game. So I actually was pretty aggressive in going ahead the few leagues where he was available. I do think he can be a number 2 running back. Maybe Clyde Edwards-Helaire becomes that number 2 in the Chiefs offense. Again, there's a little bit of risk that he takes over more of the work, but for now, I'm pretty optimistic about Hunt.
Yeah, it's almost like you want to see them let Clyde get back, and maybe after the bye week, because they have a bye in week 6. So play week 5, give him a week 6 to get ready, and then maybe Clyde's back in week 7. But for this 1 week scenario, not the easiest matchup against the Saints, but Kareem Hunt could certainly be a number 2 running back, again, with 4 teams on a bye. Let's take a look at the most dropped list, and there could be some players on this list that you still want to hold on to at some point. So you want to just keep an eye on this and see what's going to happen. Carson Steele, understandably so, why fantasy managers are moving on. Cam Akers, though, stands out to me, Heath, because we haven't got an update yet, at least I haven't seen one, on the Texans, and if Joe Mixon's going to return. If Akers is still there taking on the Bills, they have been bad against running backs. backs, mostly pass-catching running backs, so maybe Dario Gumbawale is a sneaky play here. But are you moving on from Cam Akers already with the chance that Mixon may still be out for week number 5?
I think I actually did drop Cam Akers in one league, and I didn't like it. But it's tough out there right now with 4 teams on a bye, especially if you're in a league without IR spots and you've got some of these IR spots on your bench, just trying to find the right guy to drop so you can go pick up a Trey Sermon or a Kareem Hunt. Akers is someone I would rather hold on to until we hear that Joe Mixon is back. I do think if you told me Akers was starting this week, I mean, you can see it. He's a number 3 running back, a good flex option, and for some teams, probably a starter. But there's just the roster crunch, particularly this week, was real.
And you see Sportsline has him at 43rd. They are projecting Joe Mixon to have a minimal role right now. That will clearly change if Mixon's healthy. So that's why you see Sportsline a little bit lower than we are. They do their projection model with factoring some of the injured guys coming back. All right, let's go now to the most traded list. And this is always a fun one. The last couple of weeks, it's been the 49ers guys at the top, Christian McCaffrey and Jordan Mason. Let's see if they're still the top guys of the players that are being moved in the majority of leagues. They are not. So you got Garrett Wilson and Travis Kelce and Brandon Ayuk, Travis Etienne. Those 4 feel like buy low candidates to me, Heath, across the board. Do you agree?
I almost agree. I definitely agree Wilson, Ayuk, and Etienne are buy low candidates. I'm not quite as optimistic about Wilson as I was, but the Kelce one may actually be the opposite. Like, it took one good game, and Adam Azer said on today's podcast that Kelce maybe should be a first-round pick if we're redrafting the draft right now, because he's going to be so much better than everybody else at tight end. I think people were so hungry for a great tight end that they say, oh, Kelce's back because Rice got hurt. Travis Kelce's still averaging fewer yards per reception and fewer yards per target than he did last year. And last year was his career low mark. So I don't think that Travis Kelce's going to go back to being the clear number 1. In fact, I'd still rather have Trey McBride. If somebody in your league thinks he's worth a first or second round pick right now, I think he's a sell high.
Mark Andrews also on this list, speaking of tight ends, and it's been very difficult to say even roster Mark Andrews, let alone start Mark Andrews. So where are we at with Andrews right now? Is he somebody you're trying to buy low, or is he just somebody that you're getting rid of for whatever you can?
You know, he was dropped in one of my leagues, and I wouldn't be surprised tomorrow morning if he's dropped in another one of my leagues, and I have a hard time making an argument against it. The only way that I'm buying low, and you can see I've just stopped faking Mark Andrews as a top 12 tight end, and if you're doing projections, there's really no other way to look at him. The only way I'm buying low on Andrews is if somebody else drops him, and I just have an open roster spot, and I go pick him up. I'm not giving up anybody that's on my roster for him.
I just hope that they give him some opportunities. Forget about like a huge game. Just give him some opportunities. And you know, you said it. You know, you've given up faking it. They're just when I look at the tight end position, like if I have Mark Andrews, I'm not picking up Brenton Strange to start over him. I just can't do that yet. I know I'm killing myself weekly with the way that Andrews has performed, but at some point, you know, you just keep hearing John Harbaugh saying he's going to get more involved. Lamar Jackson saying he's still my guy. At some point, they got to start to show it. You know, so I get where you're at, and I totally make sense that people just don't want to deal with the zeros anymore because potential is just that. It's not production, and right now, Mark Andrews not producing for fantasy managers. All right, let's take another one of your questions before we take a break. Again, thank you for sending them to us on Twitter and X using the hashtag AskFFT. This one is someone dropped Brock Bowers. Is he worth picking up? Obviously, has Pat Freiermuth and Mark Andrews. This is easy, Heath. You're dropping Mark Andrews for Brock Bowers.
Well, I think in this situation, I might actually drop Pat Freiermuth because if I've got Brock Bowers, I don't really care about Pat Freiermuth's floor. I just hold Mark Andrews and hope the ceiling returns. But 100%, I'd shoot all of my fab to go get Brock Bowers right now.
Yeah, I can't imagine why Bowers was dropped. Maybe it was a mistake, but that's a mistake that could work in your favor. So we'll see what happens moving forward. But yes, that does make sense. Drop Freiermuth, or maybe trade Freiermuth. You know, because if you're going to have all 3 of these tight ends, you might be able to get some significant capital in return, especially Freiermuth coming off his first touchdown in the season in Week 4 against the Colts. All right, we're going to take a break right now. We come back and get into our running back roundtable. We're going to take a look at some questionable backfields, and we're going to have our buddy, I think, Robert Turbin, joining us to talk about some of the situations in Cincinnati, some of the other backfields that are bothering us a little bit. Those answers and more next on Fantasy Football Today. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM. I lied. We're going to save the running back roundtable for our next segment. Right now, we're going to go to our other favorite segment, which is Start, Bench, Cut. And we're going to give you 3 options. You're either going to start them this week, you're going to bench them this week, are going to cut them this week, but we're going to do a little bit with a twist. We're going to do some rest of season start bench cut to give you some options of some guys that may be losing their job at some point in the next couple weeks. And we're going to start there with some running backs. So we got Jordan Mason, Chuba Hubbard, and Jerome Ford, three of the best backup running backs this season. Mason stepping in for Christian McCaffrey, Hubbard stepping in, at least for the time being, for Jonathan Brooks, and Ford stepping in for Nick Chubb, who could be back as soon as this week. So Heath, who are you starting? Who are you benching? Who are you cutting for the rest of the season?
For the rest of the season. See what you're doing here. I used to like to play this game where I could answer partially for this week and partially for the rest of the season and justify all of my answers, and you're taking that away from me. This game was hard enough without that. I will start Jordan Mason. I don't feel a great deal of confidence about when Christian McCaffrey is coming back. I will bench Jerome Ford because Nick Chubb just started practicing. No, I will bench Chuba Hubbard because Nick Chubb just started and Jonathan Brooks is not back yet. So start Mason, bench Hubbard, cut Jerome Ford.
Yeah, I was going the same route. I was surprised when you started to go the Ford-Hubbard route because it does seem like Chubb might return sooner. And look, the Browns are probably more apt to play Nick Chubb as opposed to the Panthers maybe being a little bit cautious with Jonathan Brooks because future versus present and past. Brooks, I'm sure they want to make sure he's right maybe going into next year when they could be a contender, as opposed to the Browns needing Nick Chubb to maybe save them and save some of the problems that this offense has. So yes, I totally agree. Mason could be good through November. I mean, we're getting reports that early November for McCaffrey, but there's clearly no set timetable for when he can return. Their bye is in week 10. First game would be week 11. After the bye, which is November 10th, that I think is the earliest we might see McCaffrey, but it might just be when he starts practicing as opposed to when he starts playing. So Mason, I do agree, is the guy to start. All right, let's go now for week 5, and we got 3 running backs as well. Brian Robinson Jr., Aaron Jones, and Kenneth Walker III, all coming off very strong games to certain degrees. Jones just didn't find the end zone in his revenge game, but who do you like for this week to start, to bench, and to cut out of Robinson, Jones, and Walker?
So all 3 of these guys are top 13 backs. Don't cut any of them, please. Aaron Jones is the guy I'm going to start. Ken Walker is the guy I'm going to bench, though I do love that matchup against the New York Giants. I might be the reason, now that I'm looking at the rankings, that we have Jones in the consensus ahead of Walker. I'm still sticking with it, especially in full PPR with Zach Charbonnet doing a little work in the passing game in week 4 than maybe what we expected. And Brian Robinson, unfortunately, will be the cut, even though he's my RB13 for the week.
Love all 3 of these guys as well, but we got to make it tough on Heath and myself. But yes, I would actually go a little different route. I would start Ken Walker. The matchup against the Giants, he looked great. Was actually involved in the passing. I know Charbonnet had the traditional passing downs role, and granted, as you said about the Packers, the Seahawks volume, you got to just kind of throw that out a little bit. But I think they're still throwing the ball enough to Ken Walker that he has that upside plus 3 touchdown potential, as we saw against the best run defense in football for the Detroit Lions. So the fact that he's back, he's my favorite of the trio. I'm going to bench Aaron Jones and cut Brian Robinson as well, simply because if Austin Eckler does return, that just lowers the ceiling a little bit for Robinson, but he's been fantastic all season long with Eckler, without Eckler, and he also does have, I think, still a good matchup taking on the Cleveland Browns. Let's go to the next one here, rest of season. We got 3 rookie wide receivers, not the top 3, or at least not the top 2, but we got 3 rookie wide receivers. Rest of season, who would you rather have? Xavier Leggette, who I was surprised was not on the most added list, Ladd McConkey, who's on a bye, and Rome Odunze. So who are you starting, who are you benching, who are you cutting rest of season out of Leggette, McConkey, Odunze?
Yeah, I think you said it right when you said not the top 3, because there's no Brian Thomas here either, and he is number 3 at this point, at least for me, rest of season. I'm going to start Ladd McConkey. How is it we have a first-round rookie who is averaging a 27% target share in the first month of the season, and he's not even rostered in 2/3 of leagues. So I do expect McConkey to be a top 30 wide receiver rest of season. I will bench Rome Odunze with the hope not the hope, but if something happens with Keenan Allen or DJ Moore, then maybe Rome Odunze can be a starter for you. And I'm pretty excited about Xavier Leggette. I did pick him up in a few places, but I have to cut him amongst these 3.
It's interesting. I'm going to go a different route. I'm actually going to start Leggette just with the hope that what we saw last week, 10 targets, 6 catches, 66 yards, and a touchdown. Even when Adam Thielen returns, how are you going to put that back in the box based on he's your future? Thielen is 34 years old, or I think he's 32 years old. clearly not part of what this offense is going to become. You have the Andy Dalton situation at play right now, so this offense is playing better. Clearly they can go back to Bryce Young, so that's something to factor in. But I just like the upside of what also is a first-round wide receiver finally getting his opportunity to perform. I'm going to bench Ladd McConkey. He's on a bye, so I get at least 1 week without having to worry about it. And I hate to say I'm cutting Rome Odunze, but it does speak to exactly what you said. You have a crowded receiving core and a quarterback right now that's a little bit inconsistent. So I hope Odunze in the future will be a superstar, but for 2024, he is the third of this group for me, so I'm going to cut him. Let's go now to a trio of wide receivers for this week. Start bench cut Zay Flowers, Jaxon Smith-Njigba, and Jordan Addison. 3 sophomore wide receivers coming from a different place, at least from week 4. Flowers' disappointing performance because it was a Derrick Henry show. Smith-Njigba heavily targeted in that game against the Lions, and Jordan Addison scoring 2 touchdowns, but only catching 3 passes.
Yeah, this one is different depending on the format, but assuming that we're talking full PPR, I will start Zay Flowers against the Cincinnati Bengals. I think this game has the highest over-under on the slate. It's going to get up and down the field. Lots of opportunities for Flowers, and the Bengals can't tackle. I will bench Jaxon Smith-Njigba. Also a very good matchup against the New York Giants, although I do worry that Seattle plays with a lead and maybe is a little bit more run-heavy than we've seen them the last couple of weeks. And I will cut Jordan Addison. I love the fact that he's showing that potential, but I just don't like the matchup against the Jets. I'm
with you totally. I think the one thing to keep in mind with Addison is, and this is more not just this week, but also long term, they have their bye next week. TJ Hawkinson is expected to return in week 7. And so while Sam Darnold has been absolutely fantastic, they're doing it on a low volume of pass attempts. So that's why you're only seeing 4 targets for Addison, 3 catches. He got the rushing touchdown. It's just not sustainable if he's going to be the 2 or the 3, because you know Jefferson is still going to be the leader in terms of targets. Now, hopefully they start to throw a little bit more. We saw a competitive game against the Packers, mostly from the back end when Green Bay was catching up. But unless Darnold gets consistently 35-plus pass attempts, it's difficult to say Jordan Addison will be a safe starter. So Flowers, more upside. JSN, certainly more upside if they're going to throw the ball as much as they have in Seattle. 35-plus pass attempts in 3 straight games for Geno Smith. But yes, for this week, it's start Flowers, bench JSN, and cut Jordan Addison as well. All right, we're going to take a break right now. Before we do, though, let's answer one of your questions. Again, thank you for sending them to us on Twitter, X, using the hashtag AskFFT. And this one wants to know, Johnny the Bull, should I trade Alvin Kamara for Saquon Barkley straight up in PPR? Rest of season, Heath, what do you like better, Kamara or Barkley?
You know, I've said that I'm selling high on these 29 and 30-year-old running backs who are currently performing as top 15 guys. If I say that, I've got to sell high on the number 1 guy who's 29. And I do think that I would prefer to have Barkley, who's just a little bit younger, who's in an offense I trust just a little bit more. Give me Saquon Barkley. I'd make the deal.
You also don't have to worry. He's past his bye, so Kamara still has his bye coming up, so you're going to have to lose him for 1 week. And yes, Barkley gets Lane Johnson back, hopefully better Jalen Hurts, A.J. Brown back. We saw what the potential was the first couple weeks of the season when everybody was there. Yes, I'd rather have Saquon Barkley. I'm surprised that somebody would be making that trade, but maybe they need the help for their bye week because not having Barkley is going to hurt the manager that is trading him away. All right, we'll take a break right now. When we come back, we'll get into more running back discussion. Our buddy Robert Turbin will join us. We'll talk about the backfields in Cincinnati, in Jacksonville, some problems that may be arising because the backups now becoming the starters. That's next on Fantasy Football Today. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today, presented by BetMGM. I'm Jamie Eisenberg. That's Heath Cummings. And joining us now, it's our buddy Robert Turbin, former NFL running back. And you joined us just in time as we get to our running back roundtable, Robert. So I'm going to go off script on this one because we didn't talk about it when we previewed the Thursday night game. But we got a situation in Tampa Bay as they take on Atlanta on Thursday night with their backfield with Bucky, Irving, and Rachaad White. And I'm saying that in that order on purpose because it looks like Bucky Irving's taking over the backfield. So, Robert, when you look at the Bucs and you look at what's happening right now, because Rachaad White can't run the ball very well, but he's still very good catching the ball, and Bucky Irving looks like he's running the ball much better. What do you think Tampa Bay is going to do? Are they going to make the switch and give the rookie the opportunity to be the starter?
I think eventually they make the switch and Bucky Irving becomes a starter for Tampa Bay. You look at his production on the ground, that's what they need, right? To be able to open up their play action game. But from a fantasy standpoint, if you got Bucky Irving and you drafted him or you got him out of free agency, that was a smart deal right there. I think he's going to end up being the starter and getting majority of the carries.
Heath, are we benching Rachaad White against the Falcons?
I don't know that I can, simply because the team's on a bye and the injuries. I do have Rachaad White just barely still ahead of Bucky Irving for this week because targets are more valuable for fantasy production, especially in PPR, than rush attempts are. And I still project White to hold on to a majority of the targets. And I think it's still probably 50-50 in terms of rush attempts for one more week because White was pretty decent as a rusher last week. So I agree with Robert in terms of rest of season. I think Bucky's eventually going to get more carries. This week, I would still rather start White in PPR leagues.
It is interesting, though, because I agree with you. He is the better pass catcher, but we just haven't seen the same volume to the running back position, especially the last 2 weeks with K. Dotton getting 17 targets, for example. They are using other options, but they are down 2 wide receivers. Jalen McMillan and Trey Palmer are not going to play in the game against the Falcons. All right, let's get back on script and talk about the 3 backfields that we were looking at here. And we'll start in Cincinnati, where we saw last week maybe a changing of the guard. Chase Brown coming off a huge game where he scored 2 touchdowns as the Bengals finally got their first win against Carolina. Zach Moss was still very impressive and productive, as you see, 17 PPR points for him, 23 PPR points for Chase Brown. Robert, which running back do you prefer moving forward? Certainly looking at a big game in Week 5 against Baltimore.
Yeah. Guys, this is so tough. I mean, we talked about Tampa Bay. I had faith in Rachaad White. That seems to be changing. I feel the same way about the Bengals. I mean, so much faith to start the season in Zach Moss. But the fact of the matter is Chase Brown is right on his tail and arguably has been more productive in some respects. I like Chase Brown right now out of these 2 backs. He's just been more productive, a little bit more consistent. And I think the Bengals, as the season goes on, are going to lean more towards Chase Brown.
Heath, for Week 5, who do you prefer? And then long-term, who do you prefer?
Yeah, it's a slight lean this week to Zach Moss. I view him as a low-end RB2. Brown as a high-end flex. The funny thing is, like, we think about Chase Brown as this air back who's going to do really well in the passing game. He's been pretty inefficient as a pass catcher early in his career, and Zach Moss has been better so far this year in that regard. Chase Brown somehow now getting be the guy who's good inside the 5-yard line. I'll lean slightly towards Moss this week. Rest of season, I'll go with the young guy in Brown.
It's going to be fascinating. Again, you saw 84% rostered for Chase Brown. So if you're in a 10-team league and he's still out there, please go get him because he might be the best running back in Cincinnati rest away. And Zach Moss, unfortunately, has a very lengthy injury track record. So if he does miss time at any point, Chase Brown could be a top 10 running back based on how Joe Mixon operated and potentially how we could see Chase Brown finishing the season if he gets that starting opportunity. Let's go to Jacksonville now, where we saw maybe another change happening. Tank Bigsby looked awesome against the Texans last week. 7 carries for 90 yards. Travis Etienne still getting all the work in the passing game. He's still getting the goal line opportunities, at least for the time being. But he did not look good. And there was the weird shoulder injury where he came out, then he came back in. There was some thought maybe he got benched. So, Robert, when you're looking at this backfield, is Etienne still firmly entrenched as the number 1 guy there? Or could, again, we see somebody else maybe creeping in as Bigsby continues to get better?
Yeah, this is an interesting situation, but I'm not ready to veer away from Travis Etienne just yet. Tank Bigsby is still developing as a running back in this league, and I think he's on his way to being really good. But I think Travis Etienne, even long term, is the way to go out of these 2 backs in Jacksonville.
100%. Yeah, like the one thing about Bigsby, and I think Bucky Irving could take a little bit of the passing downs work. Tank Bigsby has not received a target this year, and that's mostly because if you go back and you look at him on passing downs last year, it was absolutely terrible. So I think Etienne's got that role locked down, and I still expect Etienne to have a little more success on the ground moving forward as well. So Bigsby, I picked him up in a couple of leagues. I think he's one of the top potential handcuffs to have on your roster, but Etienne's still a starter for me.
And the way that kind of view it is, like, Bucky Irving could take over the role in Tampa Bay, the starting role, the full-time role. This is kind of, to me, similar to the Jet situation, where you're going to get the starter still in Breece Hall, and the second guy is going to get some work. Clearly, Etienne, as you said, he's going to get the work in the passing game. Hopefully still the goal line opportunities, but Bigsby's going to get some opportunities. And if he continues to get, 7 for 90, it's hard to keep off on the bench. So we'll see what happens there moving forward. All right, last backfield we're going to talk about here is in Chicago, where we thought last week we might see a changing of the guard. Roschon Johnson getting the starting nod 2 weeks ago and doing what I think a lot of people thought was a good job, but then DeAndre Swift comes out against the Rams and has the game of his life. 16 carries, 93 yards, 7 catches, 72 yards, 29.5 PPR points. Johnson still got a goal line opportunity and scored. But Robert, when you look at this backfield, what changed? Was the offensive line just better? Was Swift just better? Like, how did this, performance come out of nowhere for DeAndre Swift? Because he was miserable the first 3 weeks of the season.
He was just better, quite frankly. Sometimes that happens. I remember when I was playing, I got my job taken, and I never got it taken again after that, okay? And I was a backup to Marshawn, okay, as the number 2. And so sometimes it just lights a little fire in you, and you saw that from DeAndre Swift. Can you trust it throughout the entirety of the season? I mean, I've got DeAndre Swift on my roster on the bench. I think he was brought to Chicago for a reason. He'll end up being more productive consistently for you.
Yeah, you play the Carolina Panthers this week, you start him. He's playing the Jacksonville Jaguars next week, you start him. But you look, I think he's going to be one of the best sell high candidates maybe after that. He has a stretch later in the year, Lions, 49ers, Vikings, Lions, in the fantasy playoffs. I'm not going to want DeAndre Swift on my roster, or at least not in my starting lineup at that point.
Heath, give me 20 seconds on what's going on in New England, because you had some interesting tidbits there before the segment started. Yeah,
it came out. Mike Rice tweeted just a few minutes ago that the New England Patriots are considering starting Antonio Gibson because Ramondre Stevenson has fumbled 4 straight games. Their head coach, Gerard Mayo, saying it's under consideration. So that may be another one we have to talk about next week.
All right, so something to keep in mind there. Please make sure Antonio Gibson is rostered. He's scored 10 PPR points and more of 2 of the 4 games so far this season. Yet to score a touchdown. Ramondre was great in the first 2 weeks, miserable the last 2 weeks. It's a great matchup against the Dolphins. They have been very bad against opposing running backs, top 5 in points against. So the starting running back for New England could be very valuable. So make sure Antonio Gibson is not on the waiver wire. All right, we're going to take a break right now. We come back and get into your questions. Again, thank you for sending them to us on Twitter and X using the hashtag AskFFT. Your mailbag next here on Fantasy Football Today. Welcome back to Fantasy Football Today. Thank you for sending us questions on Twitter, X, whatever we call it these days. Just use the hashtag AskFFT. That way we know you're looking for us and we can help you. So would you trade Jonathan Taylor for Bijan Robinson in full PPR? Robert, which running back do you like better rest of the season?
I'm keeping JT all the way. I'm keeping JT in this one.
Man, can you just give me a clarification on both of their injuries? The hamstring doesn't bother me quite as much as the high ankle. I'll keep Taylor, but man, I'd like to know that ankle's okay.
Yeah, hopefully they're both 100% and we get the best of both worlds. I would probably still stick with Jonathan Taylor also because Tyler Algier has become a problem. Next question. Would you drop Rome Odunze for Wan'Dale Robinson or Xavier Leggette? Heath Cummings.
Are you starting Rome Odunze this week, and do you need to get a win? If so, I would rather have Wan'Dale Robinson if I had to have a win and I needed a starter this week. If it's just for the last spot on my bench, I would probably keep Rome.
Yeah, I'm keeping Rome for the long term in this one.
I'm going to take the other rookie who's been more productive, at least in week 4, and might be more productive rest of season. Xavier Leggette with Andy Dalton. Let's go. Next question. Would you trade one of Tyreek Hill, Nico Collins, or Malik Neighbors? Would you trade one of Tyreek Hill and Nico Collins or Malik Neighbors and Xavier Worthy for Breece Hall? So any of those wide receivers for Breece Hall, would you make that trade? Robert.
I would not. I'd keep all 4 of those wide receivers.
If I could turn Tyreek and Worthy into Breece Hall, I would make that deal.
Yeah, I might have read that incorrectly. Maybe it's Tyreek and Nico for Breece Hall, which I would definitely not do. And Neighbors and Worthy, I probably would not do that either. So just keep what you have and maybe play the waiver wire. Or just try and see if you can trade Worthy for a lesser running back to help your team. Next question. Should I trade DK Metcalf and Breece Hall away to receive Nico Collins and Brian Robinson Jr.? We got 20 seconds, Heath. What's your answer?
Yes, I would do that. Nico Collins is the best wide receiver in football.
Robert?
I would do it too, but he's not the best wide receiver in football. This is about Brian Robinson Jr. to me and his consistency.
All right, so interesting commentary on Nico Collins. For more commentary, check out our Fantasy Football Today podcast. You can find out where podcasts are available. The best podcast according to the Sports Podcast Awards. Make sure you check it out.